Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea. If each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from, also give a like. And subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. I never expected anything interesting to happen after moving to my cabin in Vermont. That's actually why I chose this place, to live quietly after 30 years of teaching third graders. The cabin sits at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by tall pine trees that creak in the wind. My only neighbors are the Petersons, who live about a quarter mile down the road, and they're nice enough to check on me once a week but know to leave me to my books and crossword puzzles. December started like any other month. I was sitting in my favorite armchair by the window, watching the first real snow of the season pile up on my porch railing, when I heard a soft thud outside my front door. At first I thought it was just snow falling from the roof, but something made me get up to check. There it was, a package wrapped in brown paper, no bigger than a large book, sitting on my welcome mat. No footprints in the fresh snow leading to or from it. Just the package, as if it had fallen from the sky. I brought it inside, my hands shaking a little as I unwrapped it. The paper fell away to reveal the most beautiful advent calendar I'd ever seen. It was made of dark, polished wood, with intricate carvings of winter scenes around the edges. 24 tiny doors, each one numbered in gold paint, covered its surface. It looked antique, the kind of thing you'd find in a museum, not on someone's doorstep. How lovely, I said to myself, running my fingers over the smooth wood. I checked the wrapping paper again, but there was no note, no return address, nothing to explain where it came from. Since it was December 1st, I figured I might as well open the first door. That's what advent calendars are for, right? Behind door number 1 was a tiny compartment containing something that made my heart stop for a moment. A small red hair ribbon, exactly like the one I used to wear to school in 2nd grade. Not just similar, but identical, down to the slightly frayed edge where my cat had once chewed on it. I sat down hard in my chair, the calendar trembling in my hands. How could this be? That ribbon had been lost over 60 years ago. I remembered crying about it for days when it disappeared during recess. The next morning I told myself I was being silly. It had to be a coincidence, just a regular red ribbon that reminded me of my old one. But when I opened door number 2, I found a tiny clay marble, swirled with blue and green, with a small chip on one side. My brother Tommy's favorite marble, the one he'd buried with our hamster in 1956. By door number 3, I wasn't sure if I was excited or terrified. This time it was a pressed daisy, brown with age but perfectly preserved. I'd kept one just like it in my diary the summer I turned 13, after Billy Parker gave it to me at the county fair. Each little treasure was something I'd lost long ago, something that held a special memory. They were impossible things, pieces of my past that shouldn't exist anymore. I told myself I should stop opening the doors, that something wasn't right about this calendar. But each morning I found myself drawn to it, unable to resist discovering what piece of my history would appear next. I didn't know then that these sweet childhood memories were just the beginning. I didn't know that each little door would soon lead me down a darker path, one where lost treasures would turn into lost lives. If I had known what that calendar would bring, I would have thrown it into the fireplace that very first day. But I didn't. Instead, I kept opening those doors, one by one, starting a countdown that would change everything. The next few days went by in a blur. Each morning I'd wake up earlier than usual, my feet carrying me to the calendar before I even had my coffee. It was like Christmas morning every day, except the gifts were pieces of my own life I thought I'd never see again. Door number 4 held my grandmother's thimble, the silver one that disappeared while I was helping her sew my prom dress. Number 5 contained a folded paper crane, the last one my student Tommy Chen made for me before he moved away in 1982. Every item was exactly as I remembered, down to the tiniest detail. But something changed when I opened door number 6. Inside was a small black button, and my hands started shaking as soon as I saw it. It was from Mr. Peterson's coat, the one he was wearing just yesterday when he waved to me from his driveway. I remember noticing it was hanging loose when he walked past. That evening, Mrs. Peterson called. "Margaret, have you seen John today? He went out to get the mail this morning and never came back inside. I can't find him anywhere." My throat went dry. I looked at the calendar on my wall, where I'd been absently playing with that black button all day. "No, Sarah, I haven't seen him since yesterday. Did you check the walking trail?" After I hung up, I couldn't stop staring at the calendar. The next door, number 7, seemed to stare back at me. For the first time, I was scared to open it. But when morning came, like every other day, I found myself standing in front of it, my fingers already reaching for the tiny latch. Behind door number 7 was a miniature scene, no bigger than a matchbox. It showed a tiny figure lying in snow next to what looked like a mailbox. My heart started pounding. I threw on my coat and boots and ran down the road toward the Petersons' house. The snow had started falling again, but I could still see footprints leading to their mailbox. And there, half covered in fresh snow, was John Peterson. Everything after that was chaos. Police cars, an ambulance, Sarah crying on her front porch. They said it was a heart attack, that these things happen. But I knew better. I knew because that little scene behind door number 7 had shown exactly how they would find him, right down to the way his arm was stretched out toward the mailbox. I should have destroyed the calendar right then, should have thrown it in the fireplace or smashed it to pieces. But when I got home, shaking and terrified, I found myself just staring at it instead. Door number 8 seemed to whisper to me, promising another secret, another piece of the puzzle. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my chair by the window, watching the snow fall and thinking about all those little treasures from my past. They weren't just memories anymore, they were warnings. But warnings of what? And why me? I decided to skip the next day's door. I made up my mind that I wouldn't open it, wouldn't play this twisted game anymore. I even covered the calendar with a blanket and put it in my hall closet. But at 3 a.m., I found myself standing in front of that closet, blanket at my feet, calendar in my trembling hands. It was like it was calling to me. The world felt fuzzy around the edges, like a dream. But the calendar was sharp and clear. My fingers moved on their own, opening door number 8. Inside was another scene, this one showing a small figure walking through what looked like my backyard, heading toward the woods. I recognized the purple scarf. It belonged to Lisa, the teenager who lived a few houses down. She always cut through my yard on her way home from the bus stop. I ran to my phone and dialed her mother's number, my hands shaking so badly I had to try 3 times to get it right. "Don't let Lisa walk home through my yard today," I said as soon as her mom answered. "Please, just pick her up from the bus stop, please." "Margaret? Are you okay? Lisa's sick today. She's not even going to school." I felt relief flood through me. Maybe I could change things. Maybe the calendar wasn't always right. But as I hung up the phone, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The timestamp on the miniature scene showed 4:30 p.m., and it was still only morning. I spent the rest of the day watching my backyard from my window, jumping at every sound. The calendar sat on my lap, that tiny scene seeming to grow clearer and more detailed with each passing hour. As 4:30 approached, I couldn't look away from the window, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The scene in the calendar was about to come true again, and I still had 15 more doors to open. At exactly 4:30, I saw Lisa walking through my backyard, wearing that purple scarf. Despite being sick, she must have decided to go out anyway. My heart jumped into my throat. "No, no, no," I whispered, pressing my hands against the cold window glass. I ran to my back door, shouting as loud as I could, "Lisa, stop! Don't go into the woods!" She turned, looking confused. That's when I saw the large branch above her, heavy with snow and ice, creaking in the wind. Without thinking, I ran out in my slippers, grabbed her arm and pulled her toward my house. We barely made it 3 steps before we heard a loud crack. The branch crashed down exactly where Lisa had been standing. Lisa started crying, and I wasn't far behind. I hugged her tight, my whole body shaking. "Let's get you inside for some hot chocolate," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Then I'm calling your mom to pick you up." After Lisa left, I sat staring at the calendar. I'd managed to save her. I'd changed what was supposed to happen, but instead of feeling relieved, I felt even more scared. The calendar had shown me the future, and I'd fought against it. Something told me it wouldn't let that happen again. Door number 9 seemed different from the others. The gold paint around its edges was darker, almost black. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I opened it. Inside was another scene, but this one was worse than before. It showed the inside of a car crashed against a tree. I recognized the red mittens on the steering wheel. They belonged to Susan, the librarian who always brought me books when the snow was too deep for me to drive into town. I called the library right away, but Susan had already left for her lunch break. I called her cell phone. No answer. I called the police, but what could I say? That my magic calendar showed me she was going to crash? They'd think I was crazy. For an hour, I paced my living room, calling Susan's number again and again. Finally, my phone rang. It was Officer Jenkins. "Margaret? We've had an accident on Pine Road. You were trying to reach Susan Brooks?" My legs gave out, and I sank into my chair. "Is she?" "She's alive, but in critical condition." "The weird thing is, we found your number dialed on her phone several times. Did you know this was going to happen?" I couldn't answer. My eyes were fixed on door number 10, which now had a faint red glow around its edges. That night, I wrapped the calendar in a trash bag and drove it to the dump. I threw it in with the other garbage and watched as the worker pushed a pile of trash over it. "Good riddance," I whispered. But when I got home, it was sitting on my kitchen table. I tried burying it in my backyard. It showed up in my bedroom. I tried locking it in my safe. It appeared under my pillow. By morning, I was exhausted and terrified. The calendar sat innocently on my coffee table, door number 10 slightly ajar, as if inviting me to look inside. I knew I shouldn't. I knew it would only show me something worse, but like every morning before, I found myself reaching for it. The scene behind door 10 made me gasp. It showed the inside of my own living room, but something was wrong. All the furniture was knocked over, and there were dark shapes that looked like footprints leading to my front door. I checked the timestamp. 11:45 p.m. tonight. For the first time since the calendar arrived, I called my daughter in Boston. "Jenny, I need you to come get me. Today. Right now." "Mom? What's wrong? You sound scared." "Please, just come. I'll explain everything when you get here." "Mom, I can't just leave work." "What's this about?" I wanted to tell her everything. About the calendar, the deaths, how it kept coming back. But I knew how it would sound. "You're right," I said instead. "I'm just being silly. I'll call you tomorrow." As I hung up, I looked at the calendar again. The scene had changed. Now it showed 2 figures in my living room instead of 1. The timestamp was still the same. Someone was going to be here at 11:45 tonight, and according to the calendar, whatever was going to happen wasn't going to be good. I had 14 hours to figure out how to stop it. 14 hours to fight against whatever evil force was working through this calendar. But deep down, I was starting to understand. You can't fight against fate forever. Eventually, the calendar would win. I just hoped I'd be strong enough to face what was coming. As night crept closer, I did everything I could think of to protect myself. I locked all the windows and doors. I called Officer Jenkins and told him I heard strange noises outside. He promised to drive by every hour, but I could tell he thought I was just a scared old lady jumping at shadows. At 11:30, I was sitting in my living room with every light on, clutching my phone in one hand and my late husband's baseball bat in the other. The calendar sat on the coffee table, that terrible scene still visible behind door number 10, 11:40. The wind picked up outside, making the windows rattle. 11:43. A car drove past Officer Jenkins doing his check. 11:44. The power went out. In the sudden darkness, I heard a key turning in my front door lock. But that was impossible. Only Jenny had a spare key, and she was in Boston. The door creaked open. "Mom?" Jenny's voice called out. "Why is it so dark in here?" My heart stopped. "Jenny, what are you doing here? I was worried about you after that weird call." Her footsteps came closer. I drove up after work. "Mom, where are you?" Before I could answer, I heard another sound, scratching at my back door. Then a thud, like someone forcing it open. "Jenny, run!" I screamed. But it was too late. Everything happened just like the scene in the calendar. The overturned furniture, the struggle, the footprints. Except the calendar hadn't shown me how it would end. The police found us an hour later, huddled in my bedroom closet. The intruder was gone, but they caught him the next day. He'd been breaking into homes all across Vermont, and my house was supposed to be empty, except Jenny's unexpected visit had spoiled his plans. I should have felt relieved. We were alive. The intruder was caught, but all I could think about was door number 11, which now seemed to have a faint pulse, like a heartbeat. Jenny wanted me to come stay with her in Boston, but I couldn't leave. The calendar wouldn't let me. I'd tried before, when I drove to the dump, but I couldn't get more than 10 miles away before getting horrible headaches and feeling like I was going to pass out. So Jenny stayed with me instead. I begged her not to open the calendar, but she didn't listen. "Mom, it's just an old Advent calendar," she said, reaching for door 11. "A beautiful one, but still just a calendar." The scene behind door 11 made her finally believe me. It showed the inside of our local grocery store, where Jenny had planned to go shopping that afternoon. In the tiny scene, the store's ceiling was caving in from the weight of snow on the roof. Jenny stared at the scene for a long time. "This can't be real," she whispered. "Things like this don't happen." But they did happen. That afternoon, the grocery store's roof collapsed. No one died, only because Jenny had called to warn the manager about a weird feeling she had. They evacuated the building just in time. That night, Jenny helped me document everything. We wrote down what was behind each door we'd opened, what had happened afterward, and what we'd tried to do to destroy the calendar. "There has to be a pattern," Jenny said, looking at our notes. "Everything the calendar shows comes true in some way. But when we warn people, we can change how it happens." "Not always," I reminded her. "Remember John Peterson? And Susan's still in the hospital. But we saved Lisa and the people at the grocery store." Jenny's voice got excited. "Mom, what if that's what the calendar wants? What if it's showing us these things so we can stop them?" I shook my head. "Then why does it feel so evil? And why won't it let me leave?" Before Jenny could answer, we heard a sound that made our blood run cold. The soft click of door number 12 opening by itself. The scene inside was the worst yet. It showed Jenny's car, the one parked in my driveway, sliding off an icy bridge. The timestamp read 3:15 p.m. tomorrow. "I won't drive anywhere," Jenny said firmly. "I'll stay right here." But we both knew it wouldn't be that simple. The calendar would find a way to make its scene come true. It always did. And now we had to decide, should we try to change fate again? Or were we just making things worse by fighting back? Looking at my daughter's face, I knew we had no choice. We had to try. But as I watched Jenny studying the tiny scene, making plans to avoid her predicted fate, I noticed something that made my heart sink. Door number 13 was starting to glow, and this time, the light was blood red. The next morning, Jenny and I tried everything to avoid what the calendar had shown. We took the battery out of her car. We called a tow truck to take it to the garage. Jenny even called her boss to say she was stuck in Vermont for another day. But by 2:45 p.m., things started going wrong in a way that seemed impossible. First, my neighbor's pipes burst. Their house was right next to the bridge the calendar had shown. Jenny, being Jenny, insisted on helping them move their belongings before water damaged everything. "I won't go near the bridge," she promised me. "We'll just help carry boxes to their daughter's house on this side of the road." At 3:40 p.m., their cat got loose. It ran straight toward the bridge. "No," I said, grabbing Jenny's arm as she instinctively moved to follow it. "Remember the calendar. Mom, it's going to freeze to death out there. We can't just let it die." At 3:10 p.m., we heard a child crying. The neighbor's grandson had chased after the cat. Jenny looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "Mom, he's only 6. I have to. Please," I begged. "We'll call someone else. There's no time." She was right. The bridge was icy, and the little boy was getting closer to the edge. Jenny ran after him, moving carefully on the slippery surface. She caught up to him just as he reached for the cat. I watched from my porch, my heart pounding, as she slowly guided both boy and cat back toward safe ground. 3:14 p.m. They were almost off the bridge. That's when we heard the crack. A large truck had ignored the bridge-closed signs and was trying to turn around. Its weight made the old bridge groan. Jenny shoved the boy toward his waiting grandmother. She took one step back. I couldn't watch, but I couldn't look away either. The bridge didn't collapse like I expected. Instead, a sheet of ice broke loose beneath Jenny's feet. The calendar had been right again, but it hadn't shown the whole truth. It didn't show that Jenny would save the little boy first. It didn't show that she'd smile at me, just for a second, before she fell. They found her downstream, alive but badly hurt. The doctors said she was lucky. A few minutes longer in the cold water, and she wouldn't have made it. While Jenny was in the hospital, I sat alone in my house, staring at door number 13. I didn't want to open it. I couldn't open it. But by now, I knew the calendar would make me look eventually. "Why are you doing this?" I asked out loud, my voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The calendar, of course, didn't answer. But door 13 swung open on its own. The scene inside made me scream. It showed the hospital, Jenny's hospital room, and in the tiny scene, the monitors next to her bed were flatlining. I drove to the hospital like a crazy person, running red lights, praying I would make it in time. When I burst into Jenny's room, she was awake, reading a magazine. "Mom? What's wrong?" Before I could answer, the power in the hospital flickered. Jenny's monitors beeped wildly for a second before going dark. "Just a power surge," the nurse said, coming in to check the machines. "The backup generators will kick in." But I knew better. The calendar hadn't shown Jenny dying. It had just shown her monitors stopping. Once again, it had told the truth, but tricked me about what that truth meant. That night, back at home, I opened door 14 with trembling fingers. Enough was enough. Whatever game the calendar was playing, I had to end it. But what I saw behind door 14 changed everything. It wasn't just another scene of disaster. It was a photograph I recognized my wedding day, 40 years ago. And in the background of the photo was something I'd never noticed before. An old man holding an advent calendar. The same advent calendar that was now sitting in my lap. Finally, I understood. This wasn't just about death and accidents. This was about time itself, and I had just 10 doors left to figure out how to break free from whatever curse I'd stumbled into. But somewhere deep inside, I was starting to wonder if I wanted to break free at all, because each disaster we'd prevented had changed something else, saved lives that might have been lost, fixed problems that needed fixing. What if door 24 showed something so terrible that all these other scenes were just practice for trying to prevent it? I looked at door 15, which was starting to glow with a strange silver light. Whatever was coming next, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't face it alone. I spent that night digging through old photo albums, looking for more pictures from my wedding day. In every single one, somewhere in the background, was that same old man with the calendar. How had I never noticed him before? Jenny came home from the hospital the next day. She was bruised and moving slowly, but alive. When I showed her the wedding photos, she went pale. "Mom," she whispered, "look at his face." I squinted at the clearest photo we had. The old man looked familiar somehow. Then it hit me. He looked like my father, but older than my father ever got to be. He died when I was 30. Door 15 opened by itself while we stared at the photo. Inside was a tiny key, old and rusty. I recognized it instantly. It was the key to my father's study, the one that went missing the day he died. "This isn't about saving people anymore," Jenny said. "This is about your past, our family." She was right. But why? And why now? Doors 16 through 20 showed us more family memories. Things that had gone wrong, moments we wished we could change. Each scene was something that had hurt our family. The day my mother gave up her dream of being an artist. The Christmas my brother ran away. The afternoon Jenny fell off her bike and I wasn't there to help her. The moment I decided not to visit my father the day before he died. The day Jenny decided not to have children because she was afraid of turning into me. Each scene hurt to watch, but none of them showed deaths or accidents like before. They showed choices, mistakes, regrets. "It's giving us a chance," Jenny said softly, "to understand something." Door 21 opened to show my father in his study, writing something at his desk. The timestamp showed a date I knew too well, the day he died. Door 22 showed him putting letters into envelopes. One was addressed to me. Door 23 showed him placing the calendar in a box, wrapping it in brown paper. My hands shook as I reached for the final door, 24. Behind it would be either salvation or doom. The door felt warm to the touch, like it was alive. "Together," Jenny said, putting her hand over mine. We opened it. The scene inside showed my living room, but not as it was now. It showed how it would look tomorrow morning. There was an envelope on the coffee table, yellowed with age. Next to it sat the calendar, but it looked different, newer, like it had just been made. And standing beside the table was the old man from the wedding photos. Only now I knew why he looked so familiar. "It's not possible," I whispered. But Jenny and I both knew what we were seeing. The old man was my father, but as he would have looked if he'd lived another 30 years. The timestamp on the scene read, "Christmas Eve, 1983. The day everything can change." Suddenly, all the deaths we'd prevented, all the accidents we'd stopped, they weren't random. They were practice, teaching us that time could be changed, that fate wasn't fixed. But changing small things was different from changing the past. What would happen if we tried to save my father? What else would change with him? I looked at the calendar, really looked at it. All those intricate carvings around the edges, they weren't winter scenes at all. They were moments from my life, carved by hands that loved me, created by a man who knew he was going to die, but hoped he could give his daughter one last gift. The question was, would I use it? Jenny squeezed my hand. Outside, snow began to fall, just like it had on the day my father died. We had until morning to decide. But really, I think we both knew there was no choice at all. Some gifts are too precious to refuse, even when they come with a price. That night, Jenny and I sat up talking, looking at old pictures of my father. We made our plan. The scene in door 24 had shown us exactly where and when we needed to be. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Jenny asked as the clock struck midnight. "Changing the past. What if something goes wrong?" I picked up the calendar, feeling its warm wood under my fingers. "Your grandfather spent years making this, planning it all out. He wouldn't have done that if it wasn't safe." At dawn, we found the envelope on my coffee table, just like the scene had shown. Inside was a letter, written in my father's handwriting. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then the calendar worked. I've spent the last 10 years of my life making it, carving every memory, every moment that shaped our family. Time is a strange thing. It can be cruel, but it can also be kind if we learn how to bend it just a little. The calendar will take you back to me, but remember, you can only stay for 1 hour. That's all the time magic I could work into the wood. Use it wisely. Love, Dad. As I finished reading, the calendar began to glow. The room around us started to fade, like an old photograph losing its color. Jenny held my hand tight. Then suddenly, we were there, in my father's study, on that December morning in 1983. He was sitting at his desk, looking exactly like I remembered. "Dad," I whispered. He turned and smiled, not surprised at all to see us. "I've been waiting for you, Margaret." He looked at Jenny. "And this must be my granddaughter." We spent that precious hour telling him everything. About our lives, about Jenny, about all the things I'd wished I could tell him over the years. He listened, smiling, sometimes wiping away tears. When our time was almost up, he handed me a new envelope. "Don't open this until you get back," he said. "And Margaret, I'm so proud of you." The room began to fade again. The last thing I saw was my father standing by his desk, healthy and alive and smiling. We came back to my living room, but something was different. The calendar was gone. In its place was the envelope my father had given me. Inside was a single photograph, my wedding day. But this time, when I looked at the background, the old man wasn't there. Instead, my father was standing next to me, his arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing at something I could no longer remember. And beneath the photo, in my father's handwriting, were the words, "Some gifts are meant to be used just once, but love stays forever." Jenny and I held each other, crying and laughing at the same time. Outside, the snow kept falling, each flake carrying a memory of what was, what could have been, and what finally was. The calendar had given us its last gift, not just a chance to change the past, but the wisdom to know that sometimes loving someone means letting them go. But now we had new memories too, ones that no one else would ever understand. And maybe that was the real magic all along. The end. I've been the bell ringer at St. Michael's Church for over 20 years now, and I thought I knew every sound those bells could make. That was until last December, when everything changed. My name is Thomas Bedford, and in our little village of Millbrook, being the church bell ringer is more than just a job. It's an honor passed down through generations. My father taught me how to ring the bells when I was just a boy, and I still remember the pride in his eyes when I first pulled those heavy ropes on my own. Our church isn't very big, but it's beautiful in its own way. The stone walls have stood for hundreds of years, and the bell tower reaches up into the sky like a finger pointing to heaven. Every Sunday, I climb the narrow, winding stairs to the bell chamber, where 4 brass bells hang silent until I wake them up. That December was colder than usual. Frost covered the windows each morning, and the village looked like it was dusted with sugar. Everyone was getting ready for Christmas, hanging wreaths, singing carols, and hurrying about with wrapped presents hidden under their coats. I loved this time of year, especially the special midnight mass on Christmas Eve, when I would ring the bells to welcome the holy night. But things started feeling strange during the first Sunday of Advent. I was in the bell tower as usual, ready for the morning service. The ropes felt different in my hands that day, colder somehow, even through my thick gloves. And when I pulled them, something about the sound wasn't quite right. Now, bell ringing is all about patterns. We call them changes, specific orders of ringing that create beautiful melodies. I know every pattern by heart, the way you know your own name. But that morning, as I rang the usual Sunday sequence, I heard notes that shouldn't have been there. It was subtle at first, like an echo that came a beat too late. The bells were playing parts of Silent Night, but I wasn't ringing that tune at all. I stopped pulling the ropes, but the extra notes kept going for a few seconds before fading away. My hands were shaking, and not from the cold. In all my years of ringing, nothing like this had ever happened. Just the wind, I told myself, though deep down I knew better. The wind doesn't play Christmas carols. That evening, as I was locking up the church, old Mrs. Thompson stopped me. She was our longest-standing choir member, and her face looked worried. "Thomas," she said, clutching her hymnal to her chest, "did you hear something odd during the service today? The bells, they sounded different." I wanted to tell her she was imagining things, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded and hurried home, trying to ignore the way the bells seemed to whisper as I walked away. I didn't sleep well that night. The sound of those phantom notes kept playing in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong in my beloved bell tower. I didn't know it then, but that was just the beginning. The bells had started their dark carol, and soon everyone would hear their song. Looking back now, I wish I had walked away that very day. But when you've been a bell ringer as long as I have, the bells become part of you. They get into your blood, your soul. And sometimes, that's exactly what they're waiting for. The next few days were quiet, but that awful feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. Every time I walked past the church, the bells seemed to be watching me, even though I know bells don't have eyes. It was Wednesday evening when it happened. We were having our usual evening service, and only a handful of people were there because of the cold. I was up in my bell tower, getting ready for the end-of-service ringing, when the ropes started moving on their own. My hands weren't even touching them. The bells began to ring out Silent Night, but it wasn't the beautiful carol everyone knows. It was slower, darker somehow, like a lullaby being sung by someone who wants to scare you rather than comfort you. I tried to grab the ropes to stop them, but they were ice cold, so cold they burned my palms through my gloves. Down in the church, I could hear people murmuring. The sound of the bells was getting louder and louder, drowning out everything else. That's when I heard Mrs. Thompson scream. I ran down the spiral staircase as fast as I could without falling. By the time I reached the bottom, people were crowded around the front pew. Mrs. Thompson was there, still sitting upright, her hymnal open on her lap. But she wasn't moving. Her face was frozen in a look of pure fear, her eyes wide open and staring at the bells above. "Call the doctor!" someone shouted. But I knew it was too late. The bells had stopped ringing, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. The village doctor said it was her heart that gave out. Natural causes, he wrote in his report. But I knew better. I had seen her face. I had heard those bells. There was nothing natural about what happened to Mrs. Thompson. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I kept thinking about how Mrs. Thompson had noticed the strange bells that Sunday. She had been the only one who said anything about it, and now she was gone. The next morning, I went to see Father Michael, our priest. He was arranging candles on the altar when I came in. "Father," I said, my voice shaking a bit, "I need to tell you about the bells." He listened carefully as I told him everything, the phantom notes, the self-ringing bells, the awful version of Silent Night. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Thomas," he finally said, "bells are just metal and rope. They can't hurt anyone." But his face had gone pale, and I saw his hands trembling as he lit another candle. "Then why are you scared, Father?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the old bookshelf behind his desk and pulled out a dusty church record book. "There's something you should see," he said, opening the book. "Mrs. Thompson isn't the first person to die like this in our church." As he turned the yellow pages, I saw dates going back nearly 100 years, and next to some of them were notes about people found in the church, just like Mrs. Thompson. All of them had died during the Christmas season. All of them had been there when the bells rang strange carols. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked. "Because I hoped it was over," Father Michael whispered. "The last death was 30 years ago, I thought. I thought the bells had finally gone quiet. Just then, from high above us, we heard a soft chiming. It was the beginning notes of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. But something was wrong with the tune. It sounded like a warning. Father Michael grabbed my arm. "Thomas, whatever you do, don't go up that tower alone again." But we both knew I would have to. I was the bell ringer after all. And somehow, I knew the bells were waiting for me. I wish I could say I was brave after that night, but I wasn't. For 3 days, I didn't go near the bell tower. Other members of the church took turns pulling the ropes for regular services. But even from my cottage on the edge of the village, I could hear the bells playing their own tunes late at night. Peter Williams, one of our younger bell ringers, came to see me on Sunday morning. His face was excited, like a child with a secret to tell. "I've figured it out, Thomas," he said, sitting at my kitchen table. "It's just the old bell mechanisms acting up. I can fix them. I'm good with metal and tools." "Peter, please," I begged. "Don't go up there alone. The bells, they're not broken, they're hungry." He laughed at me. "You've been listening to too many ghost stories, old friend." That afternoon, Peter went up to fix the bells. I stood outside the church, watching the tower, my heart beating so hard it hurt. For a while, everything was quiet. Then the bells started their awful song again. This time it was, "What child is this?" But it sounded like a scream. I ran into the church and up the tower steps, taking them 2 at a time. But when I reached the bell chamber, Peter was already gone. Only his toolbox remained, tools scattered across the floor as if he'd dropped them while running, or while being dragged. They found his body the next morning, in the church graveyard. The doctor said he must have fallen from the tower, but I knew better. The bells had taken him, just like they'd taken Mrs. Thompson. Father Michael tried to help. We brought in holy water, said special prayers, even tried to tie down the ropes. Nothing worked. The bells kept ringing their twisted carols every night, getting louder as Christmas got closer. More people started dying. First it was old Mr. Roberts, who had complained about the noise. Then Sarah from the bakery, who had tried to record the strange sounds on her phone. Each time the bells would play a different carol, turning something beautiful into something terrible. I spent my days in the village library, reading every book I could find about the church's history. That's where I found the old newspaper article from 1824. It told a story about the original bell ringers, who died when the tower was first built. They said it was an accident during construction. But the article mentioned something strange. All the bodies were found smiling, as if they'd heard something wonderful just before they died. Late one night, as I was walking home from the library, I heard the bells start up again. But this time, mixed in with the music, I heard voices singing. They were beautiful voices, perfect and clear, singing words I couldn't quite understand. I found myself walking toward the church, drawn by the sound. That's when I saw them, faces in the tower windows. Dozens of them, glowing softly in the darkness. I recognized Mrs. Thompson and Peter and all the others who had died. They were singing with the bells, their voices joining the horrible carol. I ran home and locked all my doors and windows. But I could still hear them singing. They wanted me to join them. I could feel it in my bones. The bells were calling, and they wouldn't stop until I answered. Christmas was only 3 days away, and I knew what would happen if I didn't do something. More people would die. The bells would keep taking them, one by one, adding their voices to that awful choir. That night, I made a decision. I had to end this, even if it meant going up to the tower one last time. I had to face the bells, and whatever dark power controlled them. I wrote a letter explaining everything, in case I didn't come back. Then I picked up my old ring of church keys and headed out into the cold December night. The bells were waiting for me, and this time I was ready to hear their final song. The church was different at night. My footsteps echoed off the stone walls as I walked down the empty aisle, my flashlight beam bouncing off the stained glass windows. The bells were quiet, but I could feel them waiting. In Father Michael's office, I found the old record book again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small leather journal tucked inside its pages. It belonged to William Hardy, the first bell ringer from 1824. My hands shook as I opened it. The pages were yellow and crumbling, but I could still read his words. The bells came from an old monastery in France. They say monks blessed them with holy water, but I think something else got into the metal when they were making them. Something hungry. Something that wants voices to sing with. I kept reading, my blood getting colder with each page. William wrote about how the bells would ring by themselves, playing Christmas carols that drew people in, how they needed new voices every year, how the only way to keep them quiet was to give them what they wanted, a new bell ringer to join their choir. We thought we could control them, he wrote. We were wrong. Now I can hear them calling me. Their song is so beautiful. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad to join them. That was his last entry. According to the church records, they found him in the bell tower the next day, smiling just like all the others. As I read, I started understanding things better. The bells didn't just want to kill people, they wanted singers for their dark choir. And they had to have a bell ringer's soul to keep their power. That's why they took one every few decades, when their song started getting weak. I checked the dates. The last bell ringer had died exactly 30 years ago. Now they needed a new voice, my voice. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath in the air, and then I heard it, the softest chiming of bells, playing the first Noel. But this version was different from all the others. It was beautiful, perfect. I wanted to hear more. I shook my head hard, trying to clear it. This was how they got you, by making their song irresistible. I had to fight it. But as I stood up to leave, I heard another sound mixed in with the bells. It was my father's voice, singing just like he used to when he rang the bells. He had died 5 years ago, but I would know his voice anywhere. "Dad," I whispered. The song got louder, and now I could hear others joining in. Mrs. Thompson, Peter, all the voices of the dead. They were singing together, making the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. My feet started moving on their own, taking me toward the tower stairs. Part of me knew I should run away, but a bigger part wanted to go up there, to see them all again, to join their perfect choir. The bells were calling me home. I put one foot on the first step, then another. The song grew stronger with each step I took, filling my head with its sweet poison. By the time I reached the bell chamber door, I was humming along. I knew what waited on the other side of that door. I knew what the bells wanted from me. But knowing the truth doesn't always help you escape it. With a hand that barely shook at all, I reached for the door handle. The door creaked open, and a rush of cold air hit my face. The bell chamber looked different now. Moonlight streamed through the windows, making the brass bells glow like they were on fire. And there, floating in the air between them, were the spirits. I saw them all clearly now. Mrs. Thompson smiled at me from beside the largest bell, her hymnal still in her hands. Peter waved from where he hovered near his toolbox. And there was my father, looking just like he had when he first taught me to ring the bells, his eyes twinkling with pride. "We've been waiting for you, Thomas," they said together, their voices mixing with the bell's song. The room was filled with other faces too, all the bell ringers who had come before me, all the people the bells had taken over the years. They looked happy, peaceful, like they had found something wonderful up here in their tower of song. "Join us," my father said, holding out his hand. "The bells need a new voice, your voice. Then the killing can stop, at least for another 30 years. I wanted to take his hand. Oh, how I wanted to. The bell's song was everywhere now, promising me peace and perfect music forever. No more loneliness. No more cold nights alone in my cottage. Just endless, beautiful carols with the people I loved. But then I thought about William Hardy's journal, about all the people who had died, about how the bells would just keep taking more singers, over and over, forever. No, I whispered. The singing stopped. The spirits' faces changed, turning angry. "You don't have a choice," Mrs. Thompson said. But it wasn't her voice anymore. It was something older, colder. The bells must be fed. The ropes began to move by themselves, whipping through the air like snakes. The bells started to ring, louder than I'd ever heard them, playing every carol at once in a horrible crash of sound. I covered my ears, but I couldn't block it out. The noise was inside my head now, trying to break me open and pour its poison in. That's when I saw it, the old box of matches I'd left up here last week, after lighting the tower's lanterns. And next to it, a can of oil for keeping the bell mechanism smooth. The spirits saw what I was looking at. They screamed, but I was already moving. I grabbed the oil, splashing it over the ropes and wooden beams. My father's spirit reached for me, his face twisting into something terrible. "You'll join us either way," he growled. "Maybe," I said, striking a match. "But not like this." I dropped the match. The fire caught faster than I expected, racing up the oil-soaked ropes toward the bells. The spirits shrieked, their forms flickering like bad television pictures. The bells rang harder, desperate now, their carol turning into a scream of rage. I could have run. Maybe I should have. But I stayed, watching as the flames climbed higher. The bells began to melt in the heat, their sacred metal dripping like tears. And as they melted, the spirits began to fade. My father's face was the last thing I saw before the smoke got too thick. He was smiling again, but this time it was real, proud and sad and free. The fire took me too, in the end. But I wasn't afraid. As the flames rose around me, I heard a different kind of singing, not the bell's dark carol, but something lighter, purer. The sound of spirits finally being set free. They found my body the next morning, along with the melted bells. They said I died trying to save the church from the fire. Only Father Michael knew the truth, because he found William Hardy's journal in his office. They built a new bell tower eventually, with new bells. But these bells only ring when human hands pull their ropes. And on quiet nights, if you listen carefully, you can hear a faint singing on the wind, not the sound of trapped souls, but a song of thanksgiving, grateful for their release. Some say it's just the wind in the trees, but I know better, because I'm singing with them. The new bell ringer at St. Michael's Church is a young woman named Mary. She's heard all the stories about what happened that Christmas night 5 years ago, about Thomas Bedford and the mysterious fire that destroyed the old bell tower. Every Sunday, she climbs the new tower's steps, just like I used to. The new bells are smaller than the old ones, made of bright, clean metal that's never known darkness. They ring sweet and clear, bringing joy instead of fear. Sometimes on cold December evenings, Mary says she can hear extra notes in the bell's song. Not dark or scary ones like before, but gentle harmonies that make the music more beautiful. And sometimes, she swears she sees a familiar face in the tower window, an old bell ringer, watching over his church with peaceful eyes. Father Michael keeps William Hardy's journal locked away in the church vault, along with my last letter explaining everything. He says some stories are better left untold, but he also had a small plaque put up in the bell tower. It reads, "In memory of Thomas Bedford and all the bell ringers who came before, may their songs ring forever free." I ran home and locked all my doors and windows, but I could still hear them singing. They wanted me to join them. I could feel it in my bones. The bells were calling, and they wouldn't stop until I answered. Christmas was only 3 days away, and I knew what would happen if I didn't do something. More people would die. The bells would keep taking them, one by one, adding their voices to that awful choir. That night, I made a decision. I had to end this, even if it meant going up to the tower one last time. I had to face the bells, and whatever dark power controlled them. I wrote a letter explaining everything, in case I didn't come back. Then I picked up my old ring of church keys and headed out into the cold December night. The bells were waiting for me, and this time I was ready to hear their final song. The church was different at night. My footsteps echoed off the stone walls as I walked down the empty aisle, my flashlight beam bouncing off the stained glass windows. The bells were quiet, but I could feel them waiting. In Father Michael's office, I found the old record book again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small leather journal tucked inside its pages. It belonged to William Hardy, the first bell ringer from 1824. My hands shook as I opened it. The pages were yellow and crumbling, but I could still read his words. The bells came from an old monastery in France. They say monks blessed them with holy water, but I think something else got into the metal when they were making them. Something hungry. Something that wants voices to sing with. I kept reading, my blood getting colder with each page. William wrote about how the bells would ring by themselves, playing Christmas carols that drew people in, how they needed new voices every year, how the only way to keep them quiet was to give them what they wanted, a new bell ringer to join their choir. We thought we could control them, he wrote. We were wrong. Now I can hear them calling me. Their song is so beautiful. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad to join them. That was his last entry. According to the church records, they found him in the bell tower the next day, smiling just like all the others. As I read, I started understanding things better. The bells didn't just want to kill people, they wanted singers for their dark choir, and they had to have a bell ringer's soul to keep their power. That's why they took one every few decades when their song started getting weak. I checked the dates. The last bell ringer had died exactly 30 years ago. Now they needed a new voice, my voice. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath in the air, and then I heard it, the softest chiming of bells, playing the first Noel. But this version was different from all the others. It was beautiful, perfect. I wanted to hear more. I shook my head hard, trying to clear it. This was how they got you, by making their song irresistible. I had to fight it. But as I stood up to leave, I heard another sound mixed in with the bells. It was my father's voice, singing just like he used to when he rang the bells. He had died 5 years ago, but I would know his voice anywhere. "Dad," I whispered. The song got louder, and now I could hear others joining in. Mrs. Thompson, Peter, all the voices of the dead. They were singing together, making the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. My feet started moving on their own, taking me toward the tower stairs. Part of me knew I should run away, but a bigger part wanted to go up there, to see them all again, to join their perfect choir. The bells were calling me home. I put one foot on the first step, then another. The song grew stronger with each step I took, filling my head with its sweet poison. By the time I reached the bell chamber door, I was humming along. I knew what waited on the other side of that door. I knew what the bells wanted from me. But knowing the truth doesn't always help you escape it. With a hand that barely shook at all, I reached for the door handle. The door creaked open, and a rush of cold air hit my face. The bell chamber looked different now. Moonlight streamed through the windows, making the brass bells glow like they were on fire. And there, floating in the air between them, were the spirits. I saw them all clearly now. Mrs. Thompson smiled at me from beside the largest bell, her hymnal still in her hands. Peter waved from where he hovered near his toolbox. And there was my father, looking just like he had when he first taught me to ring the bells, his eyes twinkling with pride. "We've been waiting for you, Thomas," they said together, their voices mixing with the bell's song. The room was filled with other faces too, all the bell ringers who had come before me, all the people the bells had taken over the years. They looked happy, peaceful, like they had found something wonderful up here in their tower of song. "Join us," my father said, holding out his hand. "The bells need a new voice, your voice. Then the killing can stop, at least for another 30 years. I wanted to take his hand. Oh, how I wanted to. The bells' song was everywhere now, promising me peace and perfect music forever. No more loneliness. No more cold nights alone in my cottage. Just endless, beautiful carols with the people I loved. But then I thought about William Hardy's journal, about all the people who had died, about how the bells would just keep taking more singers, over and over, forever. No, I whispered. The singing stopped. The spirits' faces changed, turning angry. You don't have a choice, Mrs. Thompson said. But it wasn't her voice anymore. It was something older, colder. The bells must be fed. The ropes began to move by themselves, whipping through the air like snakes. The bells started to ring, louder than I'd ever heard them, playing every carol at once in a horrible crash of sound. I covered my ears, but I couldn't block it out. The noise was inside my head now, trying to break me open and pour its poison in. That's when I saw it, the old box of matches I'd left up here last week, after lighting the tower's lanterns. And next to it, a can of oil for keeping the bell mechanism smooth. The spirits saw what I was looking at. They screamed, but I was already moving. I grabbed the oil, splashing it over the ropes and wooden beams. My father's spirit reached for me, his face twisting into something terrible. "You'll join us either way," he growled. "Maybe," I said, striking a match. "But not like this." I dropped the match. The fire caught faster than I expected, racing up the oil-soaked ropes toward the bells. The spirits shrieked, their forms flickering like bad television pictures. The bells rang harder, desperate now, their carol turning into a scream of rage. I could have run. Maybe I should have. But I stayed, watching as the flames climbed higher. The bells began to melt in the heat, their sacred metal dripping like tears. And as they melted, the spirits began to fade. My father's face was the last thing I saw before the smoke got too thick. He was smiling again, but this time it was real, proud and sad and free. The fire took me too, in the end. But I wasn't afraid. As the flames rose around me, I heard a different kind of singing, not the bell's dark carol, but something lighter, purer. The sound of spirits finally being set free. They found my body the next morning, along with the melted bells. They said I died trying to save the church from the fire. Only Father Michael knew the truth, because he found William Hardy's journal in his office. They built a new bell tower eventually, with new bells. But these bells only ring when human hands pull their ropes. And on quiet nights, if you listen carefully, you can hear a faint singing on the wind, not the sound of trapped souls, but a song of thanksgiving, grateful for their release. Some say it's just the wind in the trees, but I know better, because I'm singing with them. The new bell ringer at St. Michael's Church is a young woman named Mary. She's heard all the stories about what happened that Christmas night 5 years ago, about Thomas Bedford and the mysterious fire that destroyed the old bell tower. Every Sunday, she climbs the new tower's steps, just like I used to. The new bells are smaller than the old ones, made of bright, clean metal that's never known darkness. They ring sweet and clear, bringing joy instead of fear. Sometimes on cold December evenings, Mary says she can hear extra notes in the bell's song. Not dark or scary ones like before, but gentle harmonies that make the music more beautiful. And sometimes, she swears she sees a familiar face in the tower window, an old bell ringer, watching over his church with peaceful eyes. Father Michael keeps William Hardy's journal locked away in the church vault, along with my last letter explaining everything. He says some stories are better left untold, but he also had a small plaque put up in the bell tower. It reads, "In memory of Thomas Bedford and all the bell ringers who came before, may their songs ring forever free." I never thought winning a contest would turn into our worst nightmare. My name is Emily Matthews, and I've been raising my 11-year-old daughter Sophie alone since my husband passed away 3 years ago. Life hasn't been easy, but Sophie's smile always makes everything better. It was 2 weeks before Christmas when Sophie came running into the kitchen, waving a bright red flyer in her hand. "Mom, "Mom, look at this. They're having a Christmas contest at the mall." Her excitement was contagious, and I couldn't help but smile as she thrust the paper into my hands. The contest seemed simple enough. Build a miniature gingerbread house and submit it to the mall's Christmas display. The grand prize? A week-long stay in what they called the world's largest living gingerbread house. It sounded magical, like something straight out of a fairy tale. Sophie spent days working on her entry. I helped her bake the gingerbread pieces, but she did all the decorating herself. Her little house had rainbow-colored gumdrops for Christmas lights, pretzel stick fencing, and even tiny sugar figurines of us standing in front. She'd made the figures holding hands, just me and her, the way it's been since Tom died. When the judges announced Sophie's name as the winner, I thought my ears were playing tricks on me. But no, there she was, jumping up and down, screaming with joy. The crowd clapped, and for the first time in years I saw that pure, unfiltered happiness in her eyes that I remembered from before we lost her dad. The contest organizer, Mrs. Winters, was a tall woman with silver hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She handed us the key to the gingerbread house, a real metal key with a red ribbon tied to it. The house is located just outside of town, she told us. It's very special. You'll have it all to yourselves for the whole week of Christmas. Sophie couldn't stop talking about it on the drive home. "Did you see the pictures, Mom? It looks just like a real gingerbread house, and we get to live in it. This is going to be the best Christmas ever." Looking back now, I should have noticed how Mrs. Winters' hands trembled when she handed us the key. I should have paid attention to the way her voice cracked when she said the word special. But I was too caught up in Sophie's happiness, too focused on giving her the magical Christmas she deserved. The morning we were set to move in, a heavy snow started falling. The weather report warned of a coming blizzard, but we didn't care. We packed our bags with warm clothes, Christmas decorations, and Sophie's favorite stuffed bear, Mr. Buttons. As we drove toward the outskirts of town, the snow got thicker, and the world turned white around us. Then we saw it through the falling snow, a massive house that looked exactly like a giant gingerbread creation. Walls of brown that really looked like baked cookie, white icing trim along the roof, massive candy canes framing the door, and colorful candies dotting the walls. Sophie pressed her face against the car window, her breath fogging up the glass. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Mom, it's absolutely perfect." If only I had known then that perfect was exactly what it wanted us to think. If only I had trusted that strange feeling in my gut when we first stepped out of the car. But how could I have known? How could anyone have guessed that a house made of dreams could turn into our darkest nightmare? The inside of the gingerbread house was even more amazing than the outside. Every room smelled like fresh-baked cookies and sweet frosting. The walls really looked like giant pieces of gingerbread, complete with swirling patterns that reminded me of the ones Sophie had made on her miniature house. Even the furniture seemed to be made of treats, chairs that looked like stacked cookies, a table that sparkled like hardened sugar, and lampshades that glowed like translucent candy. "Can we sleep in the candy cane room?" Sophie asked, pointing to a bedroom where red and white striped wallpaper spiraled up the walls. 2 plush beds sat against opposite walls, their headboards decorated with what looked like real peppermint swirls. That first night, everything seemed perfect. We made hot chocolate in the kitchen, which had normal appliances. Thankfully, I'd been worried we'd have to cook on candy stoves, and Sophie spent hours exploring every corner of the house. But as the snow piled up outside and night fell, I started noticing things. It started with the sounds. Tiny crackling noises in the walls, like when you break a candy cane into pieces. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the way old houses do. But these sounds seemed to follow us from room to room. "Mom?" Sophie called out that first night. "Do you hear something dripping?" I did hear it, a slow, sticky-sounding drip coming from somewhere inside the walls. like syrup falling in thick drops. But when I checked the bathrooms and kitchen, all the faucets were dry. The next morning, I noticed something else strange. The sugar crystal doorknob to Sophie's room felt warm to the touch, almost like it was melting. When I tried to clean it with a damp cloth, the cloth came away sticky and pink. "Mom, look," Sophie said at breakfast. "The wall moved." I turned to where she was pointing, but everything looked normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Had that candy cane stripe always curved that way? Was that gumdrop decoration always that shade of purple? Then I found the backpack. It was stuffed behind a cabinet in the basement, a small purple backpack with the name Lucy written on the tag. When I pulled it out, it was partially dissolved, like it had been dipped in acid. The bottom was crusty with what looked like hardened caramel. "Sophie," I called upstairs, trying to keep my voice steady, "have you seen any pictures of the other contest winners?" "No," she shouted back. "But Mrs. Winters said, we're the first ones to stay here." That's when I knew something was very wrong, because there, stuck to the partially melted backpack, was a contest flyer. It was dated exactly 1 year ago. The sounds in the walls got louder that second night. The dripping became a constant rhythm, like a hungry mouth watering. And when I went to check on Sophie in the candy cane room, I could have sworn I saw the stripes on the wall twist and move, like a giant tongue running along the surface. We needed to leave, but when I tried the front door, the knob wouldn't turn. The sugar crystal windows had somehow sealed themselves shut. And outside, the blizzard raged on, cutting us off from the rest of the world. That's when I heard Sophie scream. I ran to Sophie's scream, my heart pounding. I found her in the candy cane room, pointing at the floor where a puddle of something thick and brown was seeping up through the floorboards. It smelled sickly sweet, like burnt sugar. "Mom, the floor. It tried to grab my foot." Sophie's voice shook as she hugged Mr. Buttons tighter. I didn't want to believe her, but then I saw it. The puddle moved. Not like water flowing, but like something alive, reaching out with sticky fingers toward Sophie's bed. We ran to my room and locked the door, but the locked door didn't make me feel any safer. The walls around us had changed. The gingerbread-colored surface now looked wet, glistening like it was covered in saliva. And the worst part? It was pulsing, ever so slightly, like the walls were breathing. "We need to find a way out," I said, trying to sound brave for Sophie. But every window we tried was sealed shut, covered in a layer of what looked like hardened caramel. The snow outside was piled so high I could barely see through the windows anyway. That's when we heard the voice. "Help, please help." It was faint, coming from inside the walls. A child's voice. We followed the sound to the basement. The stairs had changed. They were softer now, sinking slightly under our feet like fresh-baked cookies. The voice got louder as we reached the bottom step. In the basement's far corner, behind some boxes, we found a small door I hadn't noticed before. It was made of dark chocolate, or at least that's what it looked like. When I pulled it open, we discovered a hidden room. And in that room, "Oh my God," I whispered. The walls were covered in names and dates, scratched into the surface like desperate messages. Lucy Wilson, Christmas 2023. Tommy Chen, Christmas 2022. And dozens more, going back years. Next to each name were tally marks, counting days. "Mom?" Sophie's voice was tiny. "What happened to all these people?" Before I could answer, we heard a loud crack from upstairs, like a giant piece of candy being snapped in half. The whole house shuddered. The sweet smell became overwhelming, and I could hear the walls crackling all around us. Then the basement door slammed shut. The stairs began to melt. Sophie screamed again, but this time I joined her. Because now we could see the truth. The house wasn't just decorated like candy and gingerbread. It was hungry, and we were its next meal. The basement was getting warmer, like an oven heating up. The walls weren't just wet anymore. They were melting, dripping thick brown goo that smelled like burning sugar. I grabbed Sophie's hand and pulled her toward the stairs, but they had turned into a sticky slope of melted gingerbread. "The walls," Sophie whimpered. "Mom, look at the walls." The names scratched into the surface were disappearing, being swallowed up as the wall itself seemed to digest them. That's when everything clicked. The dissolved backpack, the missing contest winners, the warm doorknobs. This house wasn't just shaped like a gingerbread house. It was a giant stomach, and we were inside it. I heard a splash behind me and turned to see something falling from the ceiling. Not water, but some kind of clear liquid that sizzled when it hit the floor. Like stomach acid, but sweet-smelling. It was coming down faster now, filling the basement inch by inch. "We need to climb," I shouted, pointing to some pipes running up the wall. They looked solid enough, made of candy canes that hadn't started melting yet. Sophie went first, her small hands gripping the stripes as she pulled herself up. I followed right behind her. Just as we reached the top, the pipe Sophie was holding snapped off the wall. She screamed, but I caught her arm, holding her tight as the floor below us disappeared into a bubbling pool of sugary acid. We managed to crawl through a small vent in the ceiling, emerging into the kitchen. But the house I saw now was nothing like the charming place we'd walked into 2 days ago. Everything was transforming. The windows had sealed completely, covered by a thick layer of hardened sugar. The doors had melted into the walls, and the ceiling was moving, dipping down like a giant tongue trying to taste us. "Mom," Sophie said, her voice shaking. "Mr. Buttons." Her stuffed bear had fallen during our climb. We watched in horror as it sank into the floor, the carpet fibers turning into strings of taffy that wrapped around it like hungry fingers before pulling it under. The house groaned around us, and more of that sweet acid began dripping from every corner. The kitchen counter started to sink, the floor began to tilt, and the walls were closing in, trying to push us toward the center of the house, where the floor was turning into a whirlpool of melted candy and gingerbread. We ran from room to room, looking for any way out, but every escape route was sealed. The house had us trapped, and it was getting ready to digest us, just like it had done to all the others. As we huddled in what was left of the candy cane room, I could hear more voices in the walls, crying, pleading, screaming. All the people who had come before us, their last moments preserved in this monster's memories. "I won't let it take you," I promised Sophie, holding her close as the room grew warmer and warmer. "I won't let it." But looking at the dissolving walls, the acid dripping from above, and the floor turning to liquid beneath us, I wasn't sure how I could keep that promise. We were running out of time, and the house. The house was just getting started. The house was closing in fast now. The walls oozed thick brown liquid, and the floor had turned into a bubbling pool of melted candy. Sophie and I were trapped on a small island of solid floor that kept getting smaller. That's when I noticed something, a tiny crack of daylight coming through the roof where the chimney was starting to pull away from the ceiling. The house's transformation was making it unstable. If we could just reach that crack— "Sophie, listen to me carefully," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "See that light up there? That's our way out. But the gap's too small for both of us." Sophie's eyes widened as she understood what I was saying. "No, Mom, you can't." "I have to, sweetheart." I hugged her tight. "I'm going to make the gap bigger, and when I do, you climb out. Run as fast as you can. Don't look back." "I won't leave you," Sophie cried, clinging to my jacket. The floor beneath us gurgled hungrily. We had minutes, maybe seconds. I looked at my daughter, my brave, beautiful girl who'd already lost one parent. But losing her was not an option. I spotted a heavy candy cane decoration that hadn't melted yet. It would have to do. "I love you, Sophie, more than anything in this world." Before she could stop me, I grabbed the candy cane and ran to the wall. I smashed it against the weakening structure near the chimney again and again. The house screamed. A horrible sound, like cracking candy and breaking glass. The walls trembled, and more acid rained down. "Climb now," I shouted as the gap widened. The house was trying to heal itself, but I kept hitting, kept breaking, even as the acid burned my hands. Sophie scrambled up the tilting floor. Just as she reached the gap, the floor under my feet gave way. I felt myself sinking into the hot, sticky liquid. "Mom!" Sophie screamed, reaching for me. "Go!" I yelled, using the last of my strength to hit the wall one more time. The gap split wide open, letting in a blast of cold winter air. Sophie pulled herself through, just as the ceiling began to cave in. The last thing I saw was my daughter's face, framed by daylight, as the house swallowed me whole. They found Sophie half a mile away from where the house had stood, covered in snow but alive. When the rescue teams arrived at the site, there was nothing left, no house, no foundation, not even a trace of the massive gingerbread structure, just an empty clearing in the snow. The police searched for Mrs. Winters, but she had vanished too. The mall had no record of any Christmas contest, and none of the store owners remembered a silver-haired woman organizing it. The missing persons reports for the names we'd found in the basement were still open, with no answers for the families left behind. Sophie went to live with my sister, her Aunt Jane. She refused to eat gingerbread or candy canes ever again. But she kept talking about the house, warning others, even though most people just thought it was a traumatized child's imagination. Then, exactly 1 year later, a little boy in another town came running home to his parents, waving a bright red flyer, a Christmas contest, a magical gingerbread house, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And somewhere in the falling snow, a house made of cookies and candy waited patiently for its next visitors, its walls still echoing with the sounds of all the voices trapped inside. Sophie still talks about that Christmas sometimes, about how she lost her mother to a house that ate people. Most folks think she's telling stories, but every December she checks the local news of nearby towns, looking for signs, watching for bright red flyers advertising Christmas contests. Because she knows the truth, some houses aren't homes at all. They're hungry things that wear sugar and spice like a disguise, waiting for families who are too broken, too hopeful, too desperate for a perfect Christmas to notice the danger until it's too late. And sometimes, on cold winter nights when the snow is falling thick, you might catch a sweet smell in the air, like gingerbread baking. If you do, run. Run as fast as you can, because the house is still out there, and it's still hungry. The end. I never thought I'd see anything strange in my years as a prison chaplain, but what happened last Christmas Eve changed everything I believed about guilt, punishment, and redemption. My name is William Parker, and I've been the chaplain at Blackgate Maximum Security Prison for the past 8 years. It's not an easy job, but I've always felt called to help even those society has given up on. Every day, I walk through these gray halls, past the metal bars and security checkpoints, trying to bring a little light into one of the darkest places I know. Christmas is usually different here. For one day, the harsh fluorescent lights and echoing footsteps give way to simple decorations and the sound of carols playing softly through the PA system. 3 years ago, I started a tradition, a gift exchange program for the inmates. Nothing fancy, just small things from the prison commissary. Candy bars, soap, socks, paper, and pens. I thought it might help them feel human again, even if just for a moment. This year started like any other. The guards had done their usual grumbling about security risks, but they knew the routine by now. I had everything set up in the common area. A small artificial tree, no metal parts, of course some paper snowflakes the inmates in my art therapy group had made, and a table with the wrapped gifts. Looking back, I should have noticed something was different. The air felt heavier that evening, like the stillness before a storm. The lights seemed to flicker more than usual, casting strange shadows in the corners. But I was too busy making sure everything was perfect, checking my list of names, making sure every inmate who signed up would get something. "Everything ready for Santa's visit to the bad boys, Chaplain?" Officer Martinez asked with his usual smirk as he did his rounds. I just smiled and nodded. If only I'd known what was coming, I would have canceled the whole thing right then. The inmates started filing in around 7 p.m., shuffling in their orange jumpsuits, some trying to look tough, others actually letting themselves smile a little. I saw familiar faces: Big Mike, in for armed robbery; Tommy, 2 times; Wilson, serving life for murder; and Carlos Ramirez, who never talked about his crime but attended every one of my services. I picked up my list, ready to start calling names. That's when I noticed the extra packages, gifts I hadn't bought or wrapped, sitting there with perfectly crisp paper and shiny ribbons. I thought maybe one of the guards had added them, though that seemed unlikely given their usual attitude. I should have asked. I should have checked. But I didn't. Instead, I cleared my throat and called out the first name, not knowing I was about to start something that would turn our Christmas celebration into a nightmare. "Tommy Wilson," I called out, holding up a small package wrapped in red paper. Tommy walked up, trying to keep his tough guy face on, but I could see a hint of a smile beneath it. That smile didn't last long. The package felt oddly cold in my hands as I passed it to him. Tommy sat back down on one of the plastic chairs and carefully unwrapped it, like he was trying to save the paper. Inside was a small box, plain and brown. "Go ahead," I said encouragingly, when he just stared at it. "Open it up." The room got really quiet when Tommy lifted the lid. I mean really quiet. Even the usual hum of the prison's heating system seemed to fade away. Tommy's hands started shaking as he pulled out an old-fashioned gold watch on a chain. "No," he whispered. His face had gone as white as the paper snowflakes on the walls. "No, this ain't right. This can't be here." I walked over to him, concerned. "Tommy? What's wrong?" He looked up at me, and I'd never seen such fear in a grown man's eyes. This was Mr. Johnson's watch. The man eye. He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. We all knew Tommy was in for killing a shopkeeper during a robbery gone wrong. "That's impossible," I said, but my mouth had gone dry. "All gifts came from the commissary. Let me see that." As soon as my fingers touched the watch, the temperature in the room dropped so much I could see my breath. The watch felt like ice, and something else, something wrong. When I looked at its face, the hands weren't moving, stuck at 9:42. "That's when it happened," Tommy said in a voice that barely came out. "That's when he." Suddenly, Tommy doubled over like someone had punched him in the stomach. He started gasping, his eyes wide with terror. "I can feel it," he choked out. "I can feel what he felt. Oh God, I can feel everything." The other inmates started backing away. Officer Martinez stepped forward, his hand on his radio, but I held up my hand to stop him. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew calling in a riot squad would only make things worse. I looked back at the gift table. More packages had appeared, shiny ones with perfect bows that I definitely hadn't put there. Each one had an inmate's name written in beautiful handwriting that seemed to shimmer in the fluorescent lights. "Stop the exchange," I said, my voice shaking a little. "We need to stop this right now." But it was too late. Carlos had already picked up a package with his name on it, his hands trembling as he started to unwrap it. The paper crinkled in the silence, and I swear I could hear whispers. So many whispers, just at the edge of hearing. I reached for the package, but deep down, I knew we'd already set something in motion. Something that had been waiting for this moment, for this night when the walls between guilt and punishment, between past and present, were about to come crashing down. I lunged for Carlos's package, but I was too slow. He had already pulled out a small pink hair ribbon, the kind little girls wear. His face crumpled like paper as he recognized it. "Mihija," he whispered. And for the first time in 3 years, I understood why he never talked about his crime. My little girl. The ribbon moved in his hands like it was caught in a breeze, even though there wasn't any wind in the room. Carlos started crying, big tears rolling down his face. "I'm sorry," he kept saying over and over. I was drunk. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to. More inmates were reaching for their packages now. I tried to stop them, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with my bare hands. Big Mike opened his and found a wedding ring from the woman who'd been in the store he robbed, who'd had a heart attack from fear. Danny Chen found his victim's reading glasses. Each gift was something personal, something that had been with their victims in their final moments. The temperature kept dropping. I could see frost forming on the windows, spreading like spider webs across the glass. The whispers I'd heard earlier were getting louder, turning into voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Help! Tommy was on the floor now, clutching the watch. I can feel him dying. I can feel everything he felt. Officer Martinez finally grabbed his radio. We need backup in the common room now. But when he tried to use it, all that came out was static and what sounded like distant crying. The lights started flickering, faster and faster. In the darkness between each flash, I swear I saw them, shadows standing behind each inmate. Shadows that looked like people, but wrong somehow, like photographs that had been torn up and put back together wrong. We need to get out of here, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Everyone, leave your gifts and head for the door. But when inmates tried to drop the objects, they couldn't. It was like the gifts were glued to their hands. Some of them started screaming, saying they could feel what their victims felt. The fear, the pain, the confusion, the betrayal. I ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Martinez tried his keys, but none of them worked. We were trapped in here with whatever was happening. That's when I noticed another package on the table. It was smaller than the others, wrapped in simple brown paper, and it had my name on it. My hands started shaking as I looked at it. I'd never killed anyone. I was just a chaplain, trying to help these men find redemption. But something deep inside me, something I'd buried so deep I thought it would never see the light of day, started screaming at me to run. Because I knew, somehow, that whatever power was behind this knew every secret, even the ones we hide from ourselves. And it wasn't done with us yet. My package sat there on the table, calling to me like a voice in my head. Around me, the inmates were living through their worst moments all over again. Some were crying, others begging for forgiveness, and a few had gone completely quiet, their eyes fixed on things only they could see. The shadows behind them were getting clearer now. I could make out faces, so many faces. Mr. Johnson stood behind Tommy, looking exactly like his photo from the news, even wearing the same sweater vest. Behind Carlos was a little girl in a pink dress, her hair ribbon matching the one in his shaking hands. William. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. William Parker, take your gift. Officer Martinez was slumped against the wall, his radio crackling with voices that sounded like they were coming from the bottom of a well. The frost had covered all the windows now and was creeping across the walls like ivy. I didn't, I started to say, but the lie died in my throat, because I was starting to remember. With trembling fingers, I picked up my package. It was light, like it held nothing but air. As I unwrapped it, memories I'd locked away started flooding back. Inside was a small orange pill bottle, empty. No, I whispered. But the memories wouldn't stop now. I saw myself 20 years ago, working at another prison. I saw Sarah Mitchell, an inmate who'd just been denied parole. She was crying in my office, saying she couldn't take another 5 years. She begged me for help. I'd given her the pills, told her it would help her sleep. I knew she'd had problems with pills before. I knew what she'd do with a full bottle. I was trying to help her, I said to the shadows that were gathering around me. She was suffering, I thought. I thought I was being merciful. But now I could feel what Sarah felt. The hope when she saw the pills. The moment of peace when she decided. The regret when it was too late, when the darkness was closing in and she realized she wanted to live after all. Her last thoughts of her children. You see now? The voice wasn't angry. That was almost worse. It was sad. like a parent disappointed in a child. You all need to see, to understand. The shadows were solid now. Sarah standing right in front of me, looking exactly like she did that day in my office. Mr. Johnson near Tommy, Carlos's daughter, Big Mike's heart attack victim. All of them watching us with eyes that glowed like candles behind frosted glass. "Please," I begged, falling to my knees. The pill bottle was ice cold in my hands. I've spent my life trying to make up for it, trying to help people. "Helping them like you helped me?" Sarah asked, her voice echoing strangely. "Deciding their fates like you decided mine?" The walls of the prison started to fade away, turning misty and transparent. Through them I could see endless corridors, hear countless voices. This wasn't just about us anymore. This was about something bigger, something eternal. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than any ghost, that our Christmas Eve was far from over. The prison walls kept fading, like fog burning away in the morning sun. But what replaced them wasn't the outside world. It was something else. The corridors stretched on forever now, lined with countless doors. Behind each one, I could hear people reliving their worst moments over and over. "What's happening?" Officer Martinez asked, his voice barely a whisper. His radio had gone silent now, the only sound coming from the soft crying of inmates and the whispers of the shadows. "We're seeing it for what it really is," I said, understanding finally hitting me. This place, it was always more than just a prison. Sarah knelt down beside me, her ghost-light eyes looking into mine. "You tried to play God with my life, William. You thought you knew what was best. Just like all of them." She waved at the inmates. "Thought they had the right to decide the fates of others." Tommy was still clutching Mr. Johnson's watch, but he'd stopped shaking. "How long?" he asked the shadow of the man he'd killed. "How long do we have to feel this?" "Until you understand," Mr. Johnson's ghost said simply. "Until you truly understand." The little girl ghost near Carlos reached out and touched his hand. He flinched but didn't pull away. "Papa," she said, "why did you drive that night? Why didn't you listen to Mama?" "I was selfish," Carlos whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I was so selfish." More shadows were appearing now, not just our victims, but others. Hundreds of them, thousands maybe, all watching us with those glowing eyes. The air was thick with their presence, heavy with centuries of guilt and punishment and understanding. The empty pill bottle in my hand started to warm up, no longer feeling like ice. I looked at it, really looked at it, and remembered Sarah's face when I'd handed it to her. How had I convinced myself I was helping? How had I lived with myself after? "You hid from it," Sarah said, answering my thoughts. "You ran away and pretended to be a good man. You told yourself you were helping others find redemption when you couldn't even face your own guilt." The Christmas tree in the corner had changed too. Instead of cheap plastic, it was now made of shadows and light, decorated with tiny glowing orbs that looked like captured souls. The paper snowflakes on the walls had turned to frost patterns that spelled out words, names, dates, last words. I knew then that our gift exchange wasn't going to end. This was just the beginning of something much longer, something eternal. "Welcome," Sarah said, standing up and addressing all of us, "to where you really are, where you've always been." The prison had become what it truly was, a place where guilt and punishment and understanding twisted together into something beyond time, and we were all part of it now, forever. That was 3 years ago. Or maybe it was yesterday, or maybe it's happening right now. Time doesn't work the same way here anymore. The prison still looks normal to visitors, at least. That's what they tell me. They see the usual walls, the metal bars, the fluorescent lights. They don't see the endless corridors or the shadows that walk with us everywhere. Every day is Christmas Eve now. Every day we receive our gifts again. Every day we feel what they felt. But something's different now. We're different. Tommy talks to Mr. Johnson's shadow, learning about the family he left behind. Carlos reads stories to his daughter's ghost. finally being the father he should have been. Even Big Mike spends time with the woman from the store, understanding how his choices affected not just her, but her whole family. As for me, Sarah stays close. Sometimes we talk about what happened, about the choices we made. Sometimes we just sit in silence, feeling the weight of it all. The empty pill bottle never leaves my desk. My eternal gift. My constant reminder. Officer Martinez is still here too. He wasn't guilty of anything, but he chose to stay. Somebody has to watch the watchers, he says. He's the only one who can still leave, but he doesn't. I think he understands that this is more than punishment now. It's something else, something necessary. New inmates still come in. They see the normal prison at first, but sooner or later they get their own gifts, their own shadows, their own understanding. The tree stays up all year round now, its lights glowing with the memories of countless lives. The frost patterns on the walls keep writing new names, new stories. And every day, I lead services in the chapel. But they're different now. We don't pray for forgiveness anymore, we pray for understanding. Because that's what this place really is. Not just a prison, not just punishment. It's a place of learning, of feeling, of finally understanding the true weight of our choices. And so we stay, living and reliving, learning and remembering. Our gifts remind us. Our shadows teach us. And maybe, just maybe, that's the greatest gift of all, the chance to finally understand, truly understand, what we've done and who we've hurt. This is our eternity. This is our gift exchange, and it never really ends. The old iron gates of Thornfield Manor creaked as I drove through them. Even through my car windows, I could smell the damp December air. As a botanist, I was used to all kinds of plants, but I'd never seen anything quite like this place. Mistletoe was everywhere, hanging from nearly every tree branch, their white berries glowing like tiny moons in the fading light. I couldn't believe my luck when the Morrison family accepted my research request. Studying historic mistletoe farming methods wasn't exactly exciting to most people, but this family had been growing it successfully for hundreds of years. As I parked my car, I noticed how the mistletoe seemed different here, bigger, lusher, almost alive in a way that made me both excited and slightly uneasy. "You must be Dr. Morrison," a deep voice called out. I turned to see an old man in muddy boots walking toward me. His face was weathered like tree bark, and his eyes were an unusual shade of green. "I'm Edwin, the groundskeeper. The family's expecting you. Please, call me Rebecca," I said, grabbing my laptop bag and suitcase. "And yes, I'm here to study your mistletoe. I've never seen so much of it in one place." Edwin's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The Morrison mistletoe is special, all right. Been growing here longer than anyone can remember. Some say it's older than the manor itself. He took my suitcase without asking and started walking toward the house. The manor was huge, like something from an old movie. Dark stones rose up 3 stories high, and ivy crawled up the walls like green fingers. But it was the mistletoe that really caught my eye. It seemed to be growing right out of the stone in some places, which was definitely not normal. Mrs. Morrison met us at the door. She was tall and elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Welcome to Thornfield Manor, Dr. Morrison. What a lovely coincidence that you share our name." Her handshake was cold and firm. "I trust you'll find everything you need for your research. We've prepared the Blue Room for you, and you'll have full access to our gardens and archives." As I followed her inside, the heavy wooden door closed behind us with a thud that seemed too loud in the quiet hall. The inside of the manor was beautiful but felt frozen in time, like a museum where people actually lived. Family portraits lined the walls, stern faces looking down at me as I walked past. "Dinner is at 7, Mrs. Morrison said, leading me up a curved staircase. "My son James will show you the grounds tomorrow. For now, please make yourself comfortable." She opened a door to reveal a beautiful bedroom with blue wallpaper and a view of the gardens. Thank "This is perfect," I said. But Mrs. Morrison was already walking away, her footsteps echoing down the hall. I went to the window and looked out at the grounds. The mistletoe seemed to move in the wind, but there wasn't any wind. As the sun set, the white berries caught the last light, looking like hundreds of watching eyes. I told myself I was being silly. I was a scientist after all. But standing there in that old room, watching darkness creep across the garden, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stepped into something much bigger and maybe much darker than a simple research project about Christmas plants. If only I'd known then just how right that feeling was. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The bed was comfortable enough, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way the mistletoe shadows danced on my bedroom wall, or the weird creaking sounds coming from somewhere in the old house. Morning came with gray skies and a light drizzle. At breakfast, I met James Morrison, Mrs. Morrison's son. He was probably in his 30s, with the same silver-streaked hair as his mother. "Ready to see our famous mistletoe up close?" he asked, buttering his toast. I nodded eagerly, already pulling out my notebook. "I've been reading about your family's cultivation methods. Nobody else has managed to grow mistletoe this successfully." James smiled. "Family secret," he said. But something in his voice made me think he wasn't joking. We spent the morning in the gardens. I noticed right away that something was different about these plants. Normal mistletoe grows on tree branches, stealing water and nutrients from its host. But here, the plants were huge, with thick, twisted stems and berries twice the normal size. "This is impossible," I said, taking pictures with my phone. "I've never seen growth patterns like this. How do you do it?" James just shrugged. "Nature has its ways. Would you like to see the family records?" The Manor's library was dusty and dim. Old books lined the walls, and a huge wooden desk sat by the window. James pulled out some journals, their pages yellow with age. "These go back to the 1800s, he said. "Everything about our mistletoe growing is in here." But as I read through them, things got weird. There were gaps in the records, always around December, and some entries made no sense, talking about the feeding and the chosen one. When I asked James about these, he quickly changed the subject. That afternoon, I tried to email my research advisor about what I'd found, but the internet wasn't working. Service can be spotty here, Edwin told me when I mentioned it. Especially this time of year. At dinner, I noticed the family watching me. Mrs. Morrison barely touched her food, but her eyes never left my face. James kept glancing at the windows, where the mistletoe seemed to press against the glass like hands. Later, I heard voices coming from the east wing. The part of the house I'd been told was under renovation. Following the sound, I found a locked door. Through it, I could hear what sounded like singing, or maybe chanting. I hurried back to my room, telling myself I was being paranoid. But when I checked my phone again, I noticed something else strange. None of my calls were going through. And the mistletoe outside my window seemed closer than it had been yesterday, its berries glowing faintly in the moonlight. In bed that night, I pulled out one of the old journals I'd snuck from the library. Most of it was normal gardening notes, but then I found an entry that made my blood run cold. December 21st, 1856. Another successful feeding. The mistletoe grows strong. Mary Williams served her purpose well. May she nourish the growth as those before her. I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding. What kind of gardening diary talks about people serving their purpose? And why did it feel like the mistletoe was watching me through my window? Tomorrow, I decided, I needed to dig deeper into these records. But part of me wondered if maybe some secrets were better left buried in the past. I couldn't sleep after reading that strange journal entry. Around midnight, I grabbed my flashlight and snuck back to the library. If there was something wrong here, I needed to know. The library was different at night. Moonlight made weird shadows on the floor, and the mistletoe outside seemed to tap against the windows. I found more old journals hidden in a bottom drawer, covered in dust. As I read, my hands started shaking. Every December for hundreds of years, someone had gone missing at Thornfield Manor. The journals called them offerings and chosen ones. After each disappearance, the mistletoe would grow bigger and stronger. A noise made me jump, footsteps in the hallway. I clicked off my flashlight and held my breath. The footsteps passed by, but then I heard voices outside. Looking out the window, I saw people walking across the garden in the moonlight. Mrs. Morrison was leading them. They were all wearing dark clothes and carrying candles. Behind them, Edwin was dragging something long and heavy wrapped in cloth. They were heading toward the biggest patch of mistletoe I'd ever seen, a twisted mass of plants that seemed to move in the candlelight. I shouldn't have followed them, I really shouldn't have, but I had to know. Keeping to the shadows, I crept after them. The night was cold, and the wet grass soaked through my shoes. As I got closer, I could hear them singing something in words I didn't understand. They stopped under the giant mistletoe. Edwin unwrapped the cloth, and I had to cover my mouth to stop from screaming. It was a deer, probably hit by a car. But what they did next made no sense at all. They placed the deer under the mistletoe and started chanting louder. Then, right before my eyes, the mistletoe moved. Its stems reached down like fingers and wrapped around the deer. There was a sound like slurping, and the deer just disappeared. The mistletoe grew bigger, its berries glowing bright white. "It's not enough anymore," I heard Mrs. Morrison say. "The old ways must return. It needs more." "Soon," James answered. "The winter solstice approaches. We've chosen well this year." I backed away slowly but stepped on a twig. The snap seemed as loud as a gunshot in the quiet night. Everyone turned. In the candlelight, their faces looked strange, empty, like masks. And was it my imagination, or were their eyes glowing the same white as the mistletoe berries? "Dr. Morrison," Mrs. Morrison said calmly, "like we'd just met for tea. You shouldn't be out here so late. It's not safe." I ran. Behind me, nobody called out or chased me. They didn't have to. They knew I had nowhere to go. Back in my room, I tried calling for help again. Nothing. I tried opening my window to climb down. It wouldn't budge. The mistletoe outside seemed closer than ever, its berries glowing like hungry eyes. That's when I remembered what James had said. We've chosen well this year. With a sick feeling in my stomach, I realized why they'd been so happy to have me come study their mistletoe. They'd been expecting me all along. And the winter solstice was only 3 days away. I spent the rest of the night trying to find a way out. The bedroom door was locked from the outside. The windows wouldn't open. Even the old fireplace was blocked up. My phone still had no signal, and my laptop couldn't connect to anything. When morning came, Mrs. Morrison unlocked my door like nothing was wrong. "Breakfast is ready," she said with that same calm smile. "We need to talk." I thought about running, but where would I go? And I needed answers. So I followed her to the dining room, where James and Edwin were waiting. "Please sit," Mrs. Morrison said. "You must have questions." "Questions?" My voice shook. "I saw you feed a deer to your mistletoe last night. And what did you mean about choosing well this year?" James leaned forward. "Our mistletoe is special, Rebecca. It's ancient, older than this house, older than England itself. The first Morrisons found it here, made a deal with it." "A deal?" I gripped my chair tight. "What kind of deal?" "It gives our family power, long life," Mrs. Morrison said. She touched her silver hair. "I'm much older than I look, but the mistletoe needs feeding to stay strong. Regular animals used to be enough, but now," she sighed, "now it needs more. Human sacrifice," I whispered. That's what the journals meant. All those missing people. Edwin nodded. They became part of something greater. The mistletoe doesn't just take it, transforms. Those who feed it live on through it, watching, growing, understanding secrets no human was meant to know. "You're crazy," I said, standing up. "All of you. I'm leaving, and I'm calling the police." "No one would believe you," James said quietly. "And even if they did, it's too late. The mistletoe has chosen you. Can't you feel it?" I could. There was a strange pulling sensation in my chest, drawing me toward the windows where the mistletoe grew. Looking at my reflection in a mirror on the wall, I saw something that made me gasp, tiny white spots in my eyes, like mistletoe berries. "It's already starting," Mrs. Morrison said. "Fighting it will only make things harder. Join us willingly, and the transformation will be gentler." "How many?" I asked. "How many people have you killed?" "Killed?" James laughed. "We haven't killed anyone. They're all still here, still alive in their own way. Look." He pulled back the curtains. The mistletoe was moving, and in its tangled branches I saw faces. Human faces, peaceful and sleeping, their skin green-tinged and spotted with white berries. As I watched, one opened its eyes and smiled at me. I ran from the room, but only made it to the hallway before getting dizzy. Through the windows, I could see mistletoe everywhere, reaching toward the house, toward me. And now, I could hear them, whispers from the plants, voices of all the people who had come before me. They were calling my name. Behind me, the Morrison family waited patiently. They knew what I was realizing. There was no escape. The mistletoe had chosen me, and soon, very soon, I would join its ever-growing family. The winter solstice was 2 days away, and I could feel myself changing with every breath I took. They moved me to a different room that evening. It was bigger than my old one, with huge windows all around. Mistletoe grew thick outside every window, its white berries glowing brighter than ever. "The preparation room," Mrs. Morrison explained, setting down a tray of tea. "Every chosen one stays here before they join the growth." I didn't want to drink the tea, but my throat was so dry. As I sipped it, James sat in a chair nearby, watching me. "The changes will come faster now," he said. "Best not to fight them." He was right about the changes. When I looked in the mirror, my skin had a slight greenish tint. The white spots in my eyes were bigger, and my hair had streaks of silver like Mrs. Morrison's. But strangest of all, I wasn't as scared as I should have been. "Why do I feel so calm?" I asked. "The mistletoe is preparing you," James said. "It makes the transition easier. Those who fight it suffer more." Through the windows, I could see the other faces in the mistletoe more clearly now. They really did look peaceful, like they were sleeping in a garden of stars. Sometimes they opened their eyes and watched me. "What's it like?" I found myself asking. "Being part of it?" A woman's face formed in the mistletoe nearest my window. She looked young, but her voice in my head felt ancient. "It's like being everywhere and nowhere," she whispered. "Like knowing every secret of the earth. Like sleeping in starlight forever." More voices joined hers, a soft chorus in my mind. They showed me visions of what it was like, feeling the sun through leaves, drinking rain through roots, dreaming through endless winters, and waking with each spring. "You'll understand soon," Mrs. Morrison said, touching my hand. Her skin felt cool and smooth, like a berry's skin. "The solstice is tomorrow night." That should have frightened me, but instead I felt ready. Part of me was still fighting, still screaming inside to run, to fight, to do something. But that part was getting quieter. I spent that night watching the moon through the windows. My skin had started to tingle, and when I touched the glass, small vines grew from my fingertips. I should have been horrified, but they were so pretty, so delicate. The voices in the mistletoe sang to me all night, telling me stories of all the people they'd been, all the things they'd seen. They showed me how the mistletoe had grown here for thousands of years, how it had made its deal with the first Morrisons. "We are the keepers of ancient things," they whispered. "The guardians of secrets too powerful for the modern world. Join us. Dream with us. Grow with us." As the sun rose on the morning of the solstice, I looked in the mirror one last time. My eyes were almost completely white now, like mistletoe berries. Small, delicate vines grew from my hair. Part of me knew I should be terrified. Part of me wanted to break the windows, run screaming into the dawn. But a bigger part just wanted to stay, to grow, to join the endless dream in the branches. The winter solstice had arrived, and with it, my last day of being human. The sun set on the shortest day of the year. Mrs. Morrison came to get me wearing a long dark dress. "It's time," she said. I could barely walk. My feet had started growing roots. James and Edwin helped me down the stairs and out into the garden. The cold didn't bother me anymore. Neither did the way my skin glowed faintly green in the darkness. They led me to the ancient mistletoe grove where I'd seen them feed the deer. It looked different now. The branches reached down like welcoming arms, their berries shining like stars. "Don't fight it," Mrs. Morrison whispered. "Let it happen naturally." The other faces in the mistletoe watched with gentle smiles. Their voices in my head grew louder, singing an ancient song that made the ground vibrate. I stood under the largest bunch of mistletoe. Its branches swayed without wind, reaching for me. When the first vine touched my arm, it didn't hurt. It felt like coming home. More vines wrapped around me, gentle but strong. I could feel them merging with my skin, becoming part of me as I became part of them. The voices grew clearer, hundreds of them, thousands, all welcoming me to their endless dream. "Look," James said softly, pointing up. Above us, the stars seemed to dance. Or maybe I was seeing through mistletoe eyes now, understanding things my human mind never could. I saw how everything was connected. Trees, earth, sky, all of us bound together by roots deeper than time. The last thing I saw with human eyes was Mrs. Morrison smiling up at me. Then the mistletoe took me completely, and I became something else, something more. Epilogue. The new growth. Time passes differently now. I dream through days and nights, feeling the sun and rain, watching the seasons change. I'm not alone. All the others are here with me, sharing their stories, their memories, their dreams. I see everything that happens at Thornfield Manor. I watched my old phone finally die in the room where I stayed. I saw the police come looking when I was reported missing, and watched them leave with no answers. The Morrisons take care of us, feeding us through the year until each winter solstice when we need more. I used to think they were monsters. Now I understand they're just gardeners tending an ancient garden. Sometimes I see new visitors coming to the manor. Young scientists, curious researchers, lost travelers. When they look up at me, I smile with my mistletoe face. Some of them will join us eventually. The mistletoe is always hungry, always growing. That's the thing about mistletoe. It grows so innocently, so pretty with its white berries and green leaves. Everyone thinks it's just a Christmas decoration, a reason for holiday kisses. But we know better. We know its true hunger, its ancient power. And if you ever visit an old English manor and see mistletoe growing too thick, too bright, too alive, don't look too closely at the branches. You might see our faces smiling back at you. And once the mistletoe chooses you, there's no turning back.